Welcome, age of vintage society. The search for Amelia Earhart shows why some mysteries should never be solved. On a remote Pacific atoll, a high-tech hunt is underway to find out what happened to a doomed aviator in 1937. But does finding out how famous people died smother our curiosity about how they lived? Was Amelia Earhart captured by the Japanese? Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. Women, like men, should try to do the impossible, and when they fail, their failure should be a challenge to others. Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart was an author and pioneer in the field of aviation who disappeared during her attempt to circumnavigate the globe in 1937. During her life she broke new ground and set several records. Earhart also wrote best-selling books about her experiences flying and played a key role in the formation of the 99s, an organisation for female pilots. To this day she remains a figure of great fascination, and her disappearance has been a great mystery for most of the past century. But Earhart was special. Perhaps she cultivated her feminine appeal in order to raise funds for her flights, but her achievements and ambitions were thrilling by any standard. She set records flying solo across the Atlantic, non-stop across North America and from Honolulu to Oakland, and her disappearance has fascinated pilots, writers, filmmakers and conspiracy theorists for nearly a century. Earhart joined the pantheon of doomed heroines who had dared to challenge the conventions of their times and are destined to remain forever youthful in the public imagination because they died too young. You know the list: Joan of Arc, Marilyn Monroe, Princess Di. Amelia Earhart's disappearance in 1937 led to decades of wild conjectures. I asked myself if I was ready to know the truth. I wonder, are some historical mysteries best left unsolved? When a disappearance remains baffling or a murder unsolved, is the lack of resolution simply exasperating, or is the often crackpot speculation it generates a source of entertainment as well as a glimpse into the mindset of the times? Earhart was a feminist icon, best-selling author and friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and one of the very first female pilots in the world. She was 39 years old when she vanished, had planned a spectacular trip that would make her the first female flyer to circumnavigate the globe. She had already been flying for 40 days and had made more than 20 stops, including Miami, Florida, Natal, Brazil, Dakar, Senegal, Khartoum, Sudan, Calcutta, India and Darwin, Australia. When she and her navigator Fred Noonan took off from Lae in Papua New Guinea on July 2nd, their Lockheed Model 10 Electra airplane was headed for a tiny Howland Island, over 4,000 kilometres east, on the other side of the international dateline. It was the longest, most dangerous leg of the flight. This was before radar, GPS or weather satellites. Below her was only the vast ocean. She never made it. The plucky, freckle-faced aviator, or aviatrix as she was called back then, disappeared somewhere in the Pacific. Amelia Earhart was born on July 24, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. Her maternal grandfather was a well-to-do banker and judge, but her father was an alcoholic country lawyer. During her childhood the family moved frequently, and it took a while for Amelia to find herself. She tried junior college and worked as a nurse's assistant in World War I, thought about entering Smith College, enrolled at Columbia, then quit to spend time with her parents in California. In Long Beach she took her first ride in an airplane. It lasted 10 minutes. That was enough for her. "I knew I had to fly," she wrote. Amelia Earhart tried college again, tried teaching and social work in the Boston area. She continued to fly out of Denison Airport in Quincy, Massachusetts. She promoted flying, acting as a sales representative for Kinner Aircraft. She also wrote columns about aviation and laid plans for an organisation for women flyers, eventually called the 99s. One day in April 1928, Amelia Earhart got a phone call asking her, "Would you like to fly the Atlantic?" Charles Lindbergh had done it, and the publisher of his best-selling book, George Putnam, had been asked to promote a female flyer. Putnam was an heir to the G.P. Putnam Sons Publishing Company and an adventurer in his own right. He had led expeditions to the Arctic and to Baffin Island. He was married to Dorothy Binney, the daughter of Crayola co-founder Charles Binney, and had 2 sons. Amelia Earhart, of course, said yes to flying across the Atlantic. On June 17, 1928, she took off with Wilma Snuts and Louis Gordon from Newfoundland and landed in Wales 20 hours and 40 minutes later. No matter that all she did was to keep the flight log, she was a celebrity. On their return to the United States, they were greeted with a ticker-tape parade and a meeting with President Calvin Coolidge. After the flight, George Putnam continued to promote the Earhart mystique. In 1929, he divorced his wife. He asked Amelia to marry him. She said no. He asked her again 4 times. Finally, in October 1930, she said yes. They planned on a small no-fuss wedding, but George blurted out the secret and reporters besieged them. Finally, they decided to get married in Connecticut at George's mother's home in Noank, a fishing village in the town of Groton. One Friday evening, they decided to do it the next day. February the 7th, 1931 was a bitterly cold day. George's mother didn't have time to decorate the house with flowers, but did light a crackling fire. They had no guests, just 3 witnesses, George's uncle, the judge's son, and George's mother. Amelia wore a brown suit with a crepe blouse and lizard-skin shoes. Just before the ceremony, she handed George the 4-page letter. She described things they had already discussed, her reluctance to be married, and her request that he let her go after a year if she wasn't happy. She also wrote, "I want you to understand I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly." George didn't waver. After her death, George explained that Amelia needed to have a measure of freedom. She did know it for an element without which she personally could not do, as some plants can do without water but cannot survive without air. George borrowed his mother's platinum wedding band for the ceremony. Afterward, Amelia drank a glass of wine, put on her fur coat, and left with George in a car to an unknown destination. He phoned his secretary to ask her to break the news. An hour after they left Noank, reporters inundated the town with phone calls. The bewildered postmistress said she didn't think there'd been a wedding that day. George's mother said, "They didn't tell me where they were going so that I shouldn't be able to tell." 1 year later, Amelia did not ask George for a divorce. He gave her plenty of space, and the marriage worked for both of them. She later wrote, "The more one does and sees and feels, the more one is able to do, and the more genuine may be one's appreciation of fundamental things like home and love and understanding companionship." She became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic on May 20, 1932. She set other records, including 7 women's speed and distance records. But she disappeared on July 2, 1937, while attempting to fly around the world. Where in the world is Amelia Earhart? Nobody knows exactly. In the many years since her disappearance, many conspiracy theories have developed. However, the official report is as follows. 2 trained flyers disappeared over the Pacific Ocean on June 2, 1937. They were unable to find their destination of Howell Island. They ran out of fuel, crashed into the water, and sank. Earhart was legally declared dead on January 5, 1939. The exact location of the crash and reason behind it is still unknown. Skepticism aside, the alleged scoop feeds into one of the existing theories about what happened to Earhart and her navigator. She disappeared during her attempt to fly around the globe, trying to reach Howland Island in the Pacific for refueling. The official explanation is that she didn't find the island, lost communication, and ran out of fuel, only to crash into the ocean. One of the most factually based theories states Earhart and her navigator landed on Nikumaroro, formerly Gardner Island, an island near their planned landing site. This theory does not fall out of the realm of possibility. There is no conclusive evidence for either of these theories, but that hasn't stopped amateur and professional historians from digging into them. As hope for the truth dissipated, a partial skeleton was found on the island. The bones had more similarity to Earhart than 99% of individuals in an extensive sample reference, meaning these remains could be the key to understanding what truly happened. Parts of a skeleton found were initially thought to have been hers, but doctors at the time decided that they belonged to a male body. Mr. Gillespie, who backs the Nikumaroro theory, had led 11 expeditions in the South Pacific to research Earhart's fate. He pointed out that the island was uninhabited at the time when Earhart would have landed there. He and his team have recovered artifacts which they say strongly suggest the presence of an American woman from the right era, including a makeup box from the 1930s, a popular US women's moisturizer, and a jacket zipper. He also cited the timing and location of radio distress calls sent by Earhart after her plane came down. He said the calls were sent night after night, which would suggest the plane was on land, not in water, because if the radios got wet, they wouldn't work. After 6 nights, the radio signals stopped, he told the BBC. We now think that's because the airplane was landed on the reef around the island, which is flat, smooth, dries at low tide, but the tide comes in and out, and by the 6th night, he believes the airplane was washed into the ocean by the tides. So when the planes from the battleship flew over the island a week later, no plane was visible. The rest of the search took place in open ocean and found nothing. The would-be rescuers concluded that Earhart and Noonan had sunk without a trace, but despite similarities in the bones, putting together the pieces of her disappearance requires more than Earhart's final location, and thus the mystery endures. Yet people still continue to fixate on Earhart's mysterious disappearance rather than her accomplishments, and misinformation fueled by the accessibility of the internet currently conceals the factually based theories of Earhart's disappearance. To this day no one knows what happened to her and her navigator, but many conspiracy theorists speculate. A popular hypothesis suggests that the Japanese took Earhart and Noonan prisoner. In this scenario they failed to reach Howland Island and instead forcibly landed in the Japanese-held Marshall Islands, as supported by several witnesses. This idea came about from a photograph found in the National Archives, as it was implied to be a picture of Earhart and Noonan on Jaluit Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Rick Gillespie, author of Finding Amelia and executive director of the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, is certainly unconvinced. He told the BBC, "This photograph has people convinced. I'm astounded by this. I mean, my God, look at this photograph. Let's use our heads for a moment. It's undated. They think it's from 1937. OK. If it's from July 1st, 1937, then it can't be Amelia, because she hasn't taken off yet. If it's from 1935 or 1938, it can't be her. This photograph has to have been taken within a very narrow window, within a couple of days of when she disappeared." He notes that the photograph came from an Office of Naval Intelligence file saying it was very natural the US would want a picture of this Japanese naval asset. And what does the photo say that it shows? Jaluit Atoll, Jaluit Island. It doesn't say Amelia Earhart in Japanese custody. If this is a picture of Amelia Earhart in Japanese custody, where are the Japanese? There are no soldiers in this picture, nobody in uniform, he observes. The photo is subjected to facial recognition and other forensic testing, such as torso measurements. Experts on the show claim the subjects are likely Earhart and Noonan. A retired federal agent said he discovered the image in 2012 in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The blogger said he found the same image digitized in Japan's National Diet Library, but it has not been authenticated. A variation of the numerous Japanese capture theories, she was captured by the Japanese and pressed to serve as a Tokyo Rose. Some believe Earhart became a Tokyo Rose, which was an English-speaking female broadcaster of Japanese propaganda during World War II. The broadcasts were intended to lower the morale of Allied troops in the Pacific. According to other theorists, Earhart and Noonan were spies, meaning their round-world trip was just a cover-up for observing Japanese fortifications in the Pacific. But this was 4 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan and the US were not yet enemies. Proponents of this concept would also suggest Earhart did not die but was released. She was rumoured to have then returned to the US under a fake name, Irene Bolam. Bolam repeatedly denied these claims. Still, believers insisted she was Earhart even after she died in 1982. A far stretch? After all, the heroine has her back to the camera, and it's debatable how much of her hairline, let alone teeth, can really be made out reliably on a faded photograph from the 1930s. Gillespie said it doesn't match other known pictures of the famous aviator. The person who they say is Amelia Earhart might be a white woman, but her hair is way too long to be Amelia's. We have many pictures of Earhart taken the day before she took off, and her hair's a lot shorter than that. He added that the man identified as Fred Noonan does not, in his view, resemble the navigator. Further, his shirt is the wrong colour. The man is dressed in white. Noonan always wore dark shirts and dark slacks. Amelia didn't have a shirt like that with her on the trip either, so the Japanese have apparently given them new clothes. Everything about it is wrong, he concludes. I'm astounded. The conclusion drawn by the history documentary, based on the new Marshall Islands picture, is that Earhart was taken by the Japanese, later interned, and eventually died a prisoner of war. The Marshall Islands went from German to Japanese hands during World War I, and ahead of the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor became an important military post for Tokyo. The Japanese archives have no records of Earhart as a prisoner, but with many documents from these archives known to have been lost, this does not necessarily prove the story wrong. At the same time, the discovery of a single photograph that may or may not show the two lost pilots is likely to add to the mystery rather than solve it. Despite all of this, rumours still thrive around Earhart's disappearance, belittling the story of a historical woman who proved to other women that they didn't have to stick to the roles they were defined by. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. What happened with Amelia Earhart is still a mystery. So has Harry Houdini's disappearance. To find out if Harry Houdini was poisoned by his spiritualist enemies, you should watch this video.